a theory about fear, anxiety, and profit. There are some conspiracy theories so absurd that people laugh immediately. But occasionally, a conspiracy theory appears that sounds ridiculous at first, and then slowly becomes uncomfortable the more you think about it. One of those theories is this. What if pharmaceutical companies indirectly benefited from the Final Destination movies? Because those films psychologically conditioned millions of people into becoming more anxious. Not because pharmaceutical executives secretly wrote the scripts. Not because hidden advertisements were placed inside the movies. Not because there was a secret boardroom meeting where executives planned to traumatize teenagers. The theory is more subtle than that. The argument is that Final Destination did something very unusual for a horror franchise. It transformed ordinary life into a source of permanent low-level fear. The movies trained audiences to become hyper-aware of danger in everyday situations. And in a world where anxiety has become one of the most profitable conditions imaginable, that kind of psychological effect may have economic value. This essay is not claiming that pharmaceutical companies literally finance the films. There is no evidence of that. The point is that the theory accidentally reveals something deeper about modern society. Fear itself has become profitable. And few movie franchises manufactured fear more effectively than Final Destination. Horror movies usually stay on the screen. Most horror films operate within fantasy. You watch a movie about demons, serial killers, monsters, vampires, haunted dolls, or aliens. During the film, you feel tension and fear, but once the movie ends, your brain separates fiction from reality. You do not leave the theater expecting Dracula to attack you in a parking lot. The fear remains contained within the fictional world. Final Destination works differently. That franchise invades ordinary life. After watching those films, people do not merely fear cinematic monsters. They begin fearing highways, airplanes, elevators, bridges, tanning beds, escalators, gym equipment, construction sites, swimming pools, trucks carrying cargo, and even household objects. The films permanently alter how audiences interpret normal environments. That is what made the franchise culturally powerful. It weaponized everyday life. A logging truck stopped being just a logging truck. It became a symbol of possible death. An airplane stopped being transportation. It became a chain reaction catastrophe waiting to happen. A loose screw or a spilled drink suddenly felt sinister. The movies trained audiences to mentally simulate disaster scenarios constantly. What if that cable snaps? What if that ladder falls? What if one tiny mistake triggers a horrifying chain reaction? That type of thinking closely resembles real anxiety disorders. The psychological genius of Final Destination. The brilliance of the franchise lies in one terrifying concept. Death does not need supernatural powers. Physics is enough. Unlike traditional horror villains, death in Final Destination does not chase people with a knife. Instead, the films create elaborate sequences where ordinary objects interact through absurd but technically possible chains of events. A cup falls. Liquid spills. Electricity sparks. Glass breaks. Someone slips. A machine malfunctions. A person dies. The movies exaggerate these scenarios dramatically, but they remain just realistic enough to feel possible. That realism is the key. Human beings are extremely vulnerable to vivid emotional imagery. Psychologists have long understood that the brain struggles to distinguish between statistical reality and emotionally memorable events. This is why people fear plane crashes more than heart disease, even though heart disease kills vastly more people. Plane crashes are dramatic, visual, emotional, and unforgettable. Final Destination exploited this cognitive weakness perfectly. It implanted vivid catastrophic images into people's minds. And once those images exist, the brain keeps replaying them. The logging truck scene became collective trauma. There are scenes from movies that become iconic. And then there are scenes that permanently alter public behavior. The logging truck sequence from Final Destination 2 may be one of the most psychologically effective horror scenes ever created. Millions of people who watched that scene still feel uncomfortable driving behind trucks, carrying logs, or unsecured cargo decades later. Some change lanes automatically. Some slow down. Some become genuinely anxious. What makes this fascinating is that many people intellectually understand the scene is fictional and exaggerated, yet emotionally, the fear remains active. That is how conditioning works. The movie attached terror to an ordinary object. This is important because anxiety disorders often function in a similar way. The brain learns to associate neutral situations with danger. Over time, people become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats. The Final Destination movies essentially mass-produced miniature versions of this process. Not severe enough to completely disable most viewers, but strong enough to linger, strong enough to subtly reshape behavior. Anxiety is one of the most profitable conditions in modern society. Now the conspiracy theory starts becoming more interesting. Anxiety is not merely a medical issue. It is an enormous economic ecosystem. Modern society generates vast amounts of money from stress, insecurity, and emotional instability. Pharmaceutical corporations profit from anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, sleep medications, panic disorder treatments, mood stabilizers. But pharmaceuticals are only one part of the equation. Entire industries feed on anxiety. News media, social media platforms, self-help industries, wellness products, alcohol companies, nicotine products, entertainment platforms, therapy apps, productivity systems, security industries. Fear creates consumers. A calm person often consumes less compulsively. An anxious person seeks relief constantly. Modern economies increasingly revolve around emotional management. People purchase products, substances, and experiences to regulate stress. And this is what makes the Final Destination theory feel strangely believable as satire. Because those films were extraordinarily effective at generating exactly the kind of low-level psychological discomfort that modern economies monetize. Chronic low-level fear is extremely valuable. There is an important distinction between terror and anxiety. Extreme terror overwhelms people temporarily. Anxiety lingers. A person traumatized by a horror movie for 2 hours is not economically significant, but a person who becomes slightly more nervous for years afterward may alter countless behaviors. They may consume more stress-related content, seek reassurance more frequently, become more dependent on coping mechanisms, struggle with sleep, develop obsessive thinking patterns, experience increased baseline stress. This does not mean Final Destination single-handedly caused mental illness. That would be absurd. But media absolutely influences emotional perception. Advertising influences emotions. News influences emotions. Social media influences emotions. Entertainment influences emotions. Human psychology is highly programmable. And Final Destination specialized in making people perceive danger everywhere. The franchise essentially whispered the same message repeatedly. You are never truly safe. That message resonates deeply with modern anxiety culture. Modern society already functions through manufactured fear. The reason this conspiracy theory spreads online is because it reflects something people already suspect intuitively. Fear drives systems. Political campaigns use fear constantly. News corporations amplify fear because panic generates attention. Social media algorithms prioritize outrage and anxiety because emotional agitation increases engagement. Modern capitalism rewards psychological instability. This does not require secret villains controlling everything from underground bunkers. Incentives alone are enough. If fear increases engagement, profit, or consumption, systems naturally evolve toward producing more fear. That is why modern media environments often feel emotionally exhausting. Everything competes for your nervous system, and Final Destination happened to be unusually good at capturing it. The franchise turned randomness into horror. Another reason these movies affected people so deeply is that they attacked one of humanity's greatest psychological weaknesses: our inability to accept randomness. Human beings desperately want reality to feel predictable and controllable. We want to believe good decisions guarantee safety. Bad things happen for understandable reasons. Danger can be avoided through intelligence and caution. Final Destination destroys that illusion. In those films, death emerges from chaos. Tiny, meaningless accidents combine into unstoppable catastrophe. One loose screw leads to an explosion. One spilled drink causes a fatal accident. One random coincidence destroys lives. The movies present reality itself as hostile and unstable. That worldview naturally creates anxiety because it removes the sense of control people psychologically depend on. The audience begins noticing fragile systems everywhere. And the truth is, modern life really is built on fragile systems. Airplanes, traffic, electricity, industrial machinery, infrastructure, chemicals, technology. Civilization functions because millions of small components work correctly every second. The films force viewers to think about what happens when they do not. Why the theory feels true, even if it is. There is no credible evidence that pharmaceutical companies secretly sponsored Final Destination. None. But conspiracy theories often survive because they express emotional truths rather than factual truths. This theory resonates because many people already feel trapped inside systems that profit from their stress. People feel constantly stimulated, constantly worried, constantly emotionally exhausted. So when someone jokes that Final Destination was secretly created to manufacture anxiety for pharmaceutical profits, it sounds ridiculous, yet weirdly consistent with how modern society operates. That tension is what makes the idea compelling. The most disturbing part, the truly unsettling part, is that nobody needed to plan any of this intentionally. That is what separates modern systems from classic conspiracy fantasies. Traditional conspiracy theories imagine evil masterminds secretly controlling events. Reality is often less dramatic and more disturbing. Systems do not necessarily need villains. They only need incentives. If anxiety generates money, industries that amplify anxiety tend to thrive naturally. If fear increases engagement, fearful content spreads more aggressively. If emotional instability creates profitable consumers, society gradually becomes saturated with emotionally destabilizing media. No secret meeting is required. The machine rewards itself automatically. Conclusion: the idea that pharmaceutical companies secretly sponsored the Final Destination movies is almost certainly false. But the reason people find the theory entertaining is because it accidentally exposes something real about modern life. Fear has economic value. Anxiety is profitable. And Final Destination may be one of the most psychologically effective anxiety-generating entertainment franchises ever created. Those films did something few horror movies accomplish. They escaped the screen and embedded themselves into ordinary life. They transformed highways, elevators, airplanes, and random, everyday objects into sources of lingering paranoia. Millions of people still think about scenes from those movies years later, while performing completely normal activities. That level of psychological influence is rare. So no, pharmaceutical executives probably were not secretly funding horror films to increase medication sales. But the fact that the theory sounds plausible to so many people says something important about the world we live in. A society built around monetizing stress eventually becomes a society where even entertainment can feel like part of the anxiety industry. And perhaps the most terrifying thing about Final Destination is not the elaborate death scenes. It is realizing how easily human beings can be conditioned to fear the ordinary world around them forever.